this video, I'm going to discuss the twinned concepts of rhythmic density and phrase value. These are concepts that I learnt through Bob Becker's work, especially his seminal rudimental arithmetic, and concepts that I have since applied to my own compositions and to my own teaching practice as well. So in this video, I will discuss a little bit about what they are, some explorations of these concepts and how we can apply them both as players and as composers as well. I say they're twinned concepts because they don't rely on one another, but having a strong understanding of one brings a stronger understanding of the other, and they often complement each other and work well. Now, I should state that these are predominantly compositional concepts, but they can be applied practically as well, as we shall see. So I will begin with this concept known as phrase value. This is a very, very simple concept, but it's one we need to understand first before we tackle the densities. Essentially, it involves ascribing a numerical value to a figure based on how many beats of the measure it occupies. This is a totally arbitrary choice. We can ascribe a value based on any note value we choose, although it usually makes most sense to use the underlying pulse in whichever measure we're in. So if we begin with a simple paradiddle-diddle as an example, I'm treating this as being 6 strokes long with an accent at the beginning. So it's a 6-stroke note, it's a 6-stroke figure, and I'm going to treat these all as 16th notes. Very, very simple. Now, because these are 16th notes, in the time signature of 4/4, we would ascribe this a value of 1.5 or 1.5 because we are counting the quarter notes of the measure as 1, and because this contains 6 16th notes, it contains all of the first quarter note and the first half of the second quarter note. So we give this a value of 1.5. Now, this helps us to conceptualize the space in time that this figure occupies. And we are able to then essentially substitute different figures of an equivalent value without disturbing the surrounding passages, without disturbing the surrounding measure. So there are lots of different ways we can do this, depending on how we treat note values, how we treat the specific figures and passages and rudiments that we may choose to apply. But essentially, with some standard forms, there are some really simple substitutions we can make that keep the same value, but change the figure itself. And this can be a really nice compositional tool and a really nice way to do a little bit of motivic development as well. So by way of example, starting with our 16th note paradiddle-diddle with a value of 1.5, we are looking for other figures with the same value, the same 1.5 value. Now, a 5-stroke roll, phrased as an 8th note and 2 16th notes, contains the same value. It's got the same 1.5 value. Likewise, an alternating single drag played open. Or, very simply, a double paradiddle. Now, very, very simply, this knowledge can really help us adjust, manipulate, or simply change or vary a passage that we're working on, where we keep the accent or we keep the figure the same value, but we change the internal notes, we change the pattern that we're using. So taking an underlying pulse here of 1 eander, 2 eander, 3 eander, 4 eander, if I run through all 4 of these figures, we will see that they all take 1.5 beats to complete. So I will do each figure a few times and then move on to the next one. 3 eander, 4 eander. Now, that doesn't sound like much to play. It sounds like I'm just rotating through various rudiments, and essentially I am. But from a compositional standpoint, from the theoretical standpoint, they all occupy the same number of beats in the bar, specifically 1.5 in this case. So using these methods of substitution, we can take a passage, and maybe there's a figure within that passage we dislike and we want to change it, but we don't want to disturb the surrounding passage. We can substitute in a different figure with equivalent value. We take up the same amount of space within the passage and we don't disturb the surrounding figures, and that can be a nice tool to use compositionally. There are lots of different ways we can apply this and lots of different ways to work with it, and we'll look at some more examples a little later on. But we need to understand this principle of value before we tackle the main subject of today's video, which is the densities of figures. Understanding the value, we can turn our attention to these densities, the twinned concept of densities. Now, according to this concept, the density of a figure refers to the note values involved. It doesn't really matter which note values we play, but the use of the note values and how they are phrased within the figure determines its density. So sticking with our paradiddle-diddle, if we play all 6 strokes of that paradiddle-diddle in the same note value, for example, all as 16th notes, we would say that it is at its lowest density. Now, to increase the density, we need to do 2 things. First of all, we change some of the note values within the figure. And secondly, and this is the crucial part pertinent to what we spoke about a moment ago, we retain the same value. In order for the density to increase within a figure, the value needs to be the same. So we will see this in action by manipulating our paradiddle-diddle figure. So traditionally, again, not always, this is not a rule, but traditionally, typically, a paradiddle-diddle figure will begin with an accent. So we are going to conceptualize our paradiddle-diddle as consisting of an accent followed by 5 unaccented strokes. So very simply, if we play those all as the same note value, it does not matter what note value those are, it matters that they are all the same note value. If we say they are all 16th notes, then that's fine. They are all 16th notes. So its density, the density of that figure, is the lowest it can get. It doesn't really matter if we were to say they were 8th note triplets, sextuplets, 32nd notes, or anything else, half notes. It doesn't change the concept of the density. Essentially, lowest density means all notes in the figure are the same note value. Now, for our purposes, we're going to explore increasing the density and maintaining the same value. We're going to treat this paradiddle-diddle as being in 16th note triplets, sextuplets. So we're counting and feeling this, 1 and a 1 and a 2 and a 2 and a 3 and a 3 and a 4 and a 4 and a. This will give us a value of 1. So one instance of this paradiddle-diddle figure as 16th note triplets takes up 1 quarter note. 1 and a 1 and a 2 and a 2 and a 3 and a 3 and a, etc. So 4 instances of the figure will take up 4 beats of the bar. We are going to increase the density of the 5 unaccented strokes by increasing the note value of the single accented stroke. And doing this will give us some very interesting results. So first of all, let's say we wanted to increase the value of the accent to an 8th note. We now have an accented 8th note followed by 5 unaccented 16th notes. As it is, this has increased the value. So we're not able to do this. We need to change something to keep the value the same. Remember, at the moment, we are trying to retain the value of 1 quarter note. Now, an 8th note and 5 16th notes doesn't go into a quarter note unless we start using tuplets. If we think of the tuplet known as a septuplet, specifically a 16th note septuplet, this means we are playing 7 evenly spaced 16th notes per beat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, if we convert the first 2 16th notes of that septuplet into an 8th note, we have 1 8th note followed by 5 16th notes in the space of 1 quarter note. Because they are phrased as a septuplet, we have the same value, 1 quarter note, but the density has increased because those 5 16th notes have gone from being as sextuplets to septuplets. We're now feeling our paradiddle-diddle as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whereas previously 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If I play these next to each other, you will hear what I mean. In both cases, the accent hasn't changed. The accent is still on the beat. 1 and a 1 and a 2 and a 2 and a 3, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 4, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1 and a 1 and a 2 and a 2 and a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. Counting the sevens is quite tricky, but hopefully it gives you an idea of what's happening there. We have changed the density by moving up a tuplet and adjusting the note values within. It's quite a difficult one to get your head around in the first case, but it can be very, very powerful once you understand it. So let's start looking at some more examples here. This time, we're going to break away from having a tuplet over the whole measure, the whole figure, and instead start with that accented eighth note on its own. So an eighth note on its own, of course, takes up 1/2 of a quarter note. So if our eighth note accent takes up the first half of the beat, we have 5 strokes to fit in to the second half of the beat. Now, ordinarily, 5 strokes wouldn't go in to an eighth note unless we use another tuplet. So this time we're going to apply a 32nd note quintuplet to those 5 remaining strokes. So our paradiddle-diddle figure now becomes 1 accented eighth note and 5 32nd note quintuplets. This still has the same value of 1 quarter note. So we're feeling this 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5. That still has the same value of 1 quarter note. So let's put these 3 in sequence now, going from the lowest density sextuplet to the septuplet with an accented eighth note at the beginning to the accented eighth note followed by the 5 32nd note quintuplets. Now, obviously, this is the sort of thing you would want to practice with a metronome to make sure your timing is really strong. But again, from a compositional perspective, as we shall see when we explore some examples, this can be a very, very powerful tool. Sticking with this theme, beginning with the accented eighth note on its own, occupying the first half of the beat, if we didn't want to use a tuplet on the second half of the beat for those 5 remaining notes, we could instead apply another rudiment, specifically the flam. And this is a really powerful tool and a really interesting way to apply the rudiments in the sense of vocabulary. We are this time going to consider essentially a 5-stroke roll, beginning with the accent. And you can see there I'm sticking it right, 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 left, left, right, 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 left, left, 1, and E and O1, and E and O1, and E and I've got the eighth note, and then 4 32nd notes. Those 4 32nd notes occupy the second half of the beat. Now, of course, we're missing that second stroke of the paradiddle-diddle, that left hand. We're very simply going to apply that as a flam before we start the double stroke roll. Right, left, right, right, left, left. That left hand becomes the flam. This has the same effect as the previous example, but instead of using a quintuplet, we're using simple 32nd notes and the addition of a flam. So if I play those 2 next to each other, they take the same concept, but they're employed differently, and it's quite a nice effect. So this time, I'll go from the eighth note into the 5 32nd note quintuplets for a few repetitions, and then the eighth note into the 32nd notes with a flam for a few repetitions. It's the same sticking, it's the same figure, it's the same note value, but the densities have changed. Notice in this example with the quintuplet, all 5 of those remaining strokes can be heard evenly. With the flam, they can't. One of those strokes becomes a flam followed by 4 32nd notes. Finally, we can change the value of the accent again. We'll move away from eighth notes this time, and we'll deal with a dotted 16th note. Now, this one is very simple and doesn't require the use of tuplets, because if we have a dotted 16th note, we have 5 32nd notes left within the beat. So we can very simply phrase our remaining 5 strokes of the paradiddle-diddle as the remaining 5 strokes of the 32nd notes of the beat. So we're now feeling our paradiddle-diddle as 1 E and 1 E and 1 E and that first accent occupies the first dotted 16th note, and then the remaining 5 strokes occupy the remaining 5 32nd notes of the beat. 1 E and 1 E and 1 E. Now, I will play all 5 of these examples in order, and you will hear how the accent does not move within the measure. The accent is always on the beat, but the density in between each accent changes each time. So I will do each example a few times and then move on to the next one, and hopefully you will hear how the accent doesn't move, but the density changes, beginning with the sextuplet at its lowest density. And this can be a really powerful way to compose. We can really manipulate our phrases in this manner by taking one simple figure, in this instance the paradiddle-diddle, and running it through different variations of its density, and we create some really interesting ways to voice the same phrase over a longer passage. And it can be a very powerful and a very useful compositional tool. And in a moment we will look at some of the ways in which this can be employed in the repertoire. Now it's worth clarifying here that everything I have just demonstrated are essentially arbitrary choices that we can make. There is nothing that says I have to change the accent at the beginning to an eighth note or a dotted 16th note, or even that I have to change the value of the accent at all. We can change any or all or none or some of the notes within that figure to get the same effect. It just becomes a little bit more complicated mathematically. We have to work out how we need to adjust the other strokes in the figure to maintain that overall density, because we need to remember the overall concept. In order to change the density of the figure, its value has to stay the same. The density of a figure is tied up with the idea of value. So let's have a look at some examples of this in the repertoire. And to do this, I'm going to look at one example from Bob Becker and then two examples of my own. So the first example is from Bob Becker's Honourable Discharge, which is his first etude in his rudimental arithmetic book, which I mentioned earlier. It's a fantastic book, by the way. For those of you interested in this sort of thing, it is a really deep, intellectual and comprehensive study of mathematics as it applies to the drum rudiments. It's absolutely fascinating and changed my life and changed my career from a musical perspective. Very, very fascinating. So in this example, and you will see where my influences have come from for this video, he begins with a paradiddle-diddle, and he simply changes the density in his bar. So we're in a simple time signature here of 4/4, and he plays 3 paradiddle-diddles in a really interesting way. The first 2 instances are one of the examples we talked about earlier, with an 8th note accent followed by 5 32nd note quintuplets afterwards. We then have a drag figure followed by one final paradiddle-diddle. And just look at how he's placed them throughout the measure and how the density alters across the beats and throughout the course of that passage. It's really fascinating. Really interesting figure, and what really started all of this for me, this journey for me in exploring this material. Next, an example from one of my pieces entitled Numinous Measure. Now, this one is quite tricky in terms of its rhythmic background. This is written in 15/16. Now, that's not as difficult as it sounds. This is essentially describing 3 quintuplets per bar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if it helps, we can consider this piece as being in 3/4, and each quarter note gets a quintuplet. That gives us a bit of background, but essentially the principle is the same. I'm sticking with paradiddle-diddles, and I'm running through 3 densities. However, the density of the third paradiddle-diddle is split over more beats. The first 2 paradiddle-diddles take up 1 beat of the bar, sticking in 3/4, and the third paradiddle-diddle takes up 2 beats of the bar. So I've not only changed the density, but I've changed the value. So I've gone from 2 instances of the same value to 1 instance of a double value, and the density changes each time. So it looks like this, and it sounds like this. Doesn't sound like much on its own, but in context it provides a really interesting speeding up and then slowing down effect where we play the same paradiddle-diddle figure each time. It's, as I say, I really had a lot of fun and got a lot of enjoyment from applying and studying this material in my own work. One more example, this is quite a complex one of rhythmic value substitution from my own work, and this is a piece called 24 Permutations, which is an etude. So this is an educational piece, and it plays quite heavily on this theme of value substitution. So for this piece, I took 4 groupings of 16th notes, 9, 8, 4, and 3. I won't go into why. There's all sorts of papers out there on why I did this. But I took a 9-note grouping, an 8-note grouping, a 4-note grouping, and a 3-note grouping, and I play different permutations of that of those 4 groupings throughout the piece. So in every measure, and the two in particular is 8394, that's just one permutation, and then 8349, a second permutation. So that's the entire etude, running through the different permutations of these four groups of notes. Now, because those values were set for me, it was a case of substituting in the relevant figures to match those values. So over the course of these two figures, of these two measures, we have 8 16th notes, 3 16th notes, 9 16th notes, and 4 16th notes, and then 8, 3, 4, and 9. So I was looking for figures, rudiments, patterns, any kind of little vocabularic ideas to fit those values, and throughout the course of the piece I substituted different rudiments, different figures, different patterns to fit those values. So this is in the time signature of 12/8, so we're in a ternary time signature. So all of the underlying values are done on dotted quarter notes, 3/8 notes to the beat, and this has got a kind of lilting swing to it, but it's disguised by the use of the substitution. So this is 8394, 8349. Sounds like this. Something like that. And that was based on a lot of drag figures. I was studying drags at the time of writing that, and a lot of single drags, double drags, alternating and non-alternating, left and 25s and that sort of thing, and exploring how substituting drags of different values into this arrangement I had created, exploring the results it generated. And I was very pleased with the results. And this out of context example doesn't give you much to go on, but it does show you a real world example of how this material can be applied. I would encourage you certainly to explore this further if you're interested. Bob Becker's Rudimental Arithmetic is the place to start. A lot of my own material and my own subject study covers this as well. I've got some research papers written on this, which you can find if you're interested. But it's really wonderful to see how the mathematical aspects and the numerical aspects, if we so choose, can inform our musical choices. But if nothing else, this might give you a few tools to think about from your composition and perhaps for your own playing as well. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it.